when two corrupt officers ruthlessly killed a devoted father in front of his young son. They believed they had buried their secret forever. 2 decades later, he returns with a vengeance, determined to reveal the truth behind the tragedy that continues to haunt him. What he uncovers will shake him to his core and leave you speechless. Who was truly responsible for his father's murder, and how far does the conspiracy extend? Stay tuned to discover. Before we begin, let us know where you're tuning in from today. If compelling tales of justice and redemption motivate you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the lake. Jack Reynolds sat on a weathered wooden dock, his fishing rod resting on his lap, observing the gentle ripples in the water. His 10-year-old son Noah sat beside him, legs dangling over the edge. "Think we'll catch anything today, Dad?" Noah asked, his voice soft yet hopeful. Jack glanced at his son and smiled. "Maybe if we're patient enough." He tousled Noah's hair. "It's not really about the fish anyway." Noah didn't reply, but his quiet grin spoke volumes. This was their time together, away from the hustle of the city, away from Jack's demanding job as a police officer. It was just them, the water, and the woods. They'd been out for hours, and the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the lake with hues of orange and purple. Jack stood up, stretching his back, ready to head home. "Bud?" he asked, his voice relaxed. Noah nodded, standing up and brushing off his pants. Jack reeled in his line and stowed away the tackle box, savoring the tranquility. But as he gathered the gear and turned to leave, something shifted in the air. The serenity that surrounded them began to feel unnatural, almost too quiet. Then Jack heard it, a rustling from the trees behind them. His eyes narrowed. He wasn't the type to get anxious, but his instincts, honed from years on the force, kicked in quickly. He placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, firm yet gentle. "Stay close to me," he whispered, the warmth leaving his voice. Noah's face tensed. "What is it?" Before Jack could respond, 2 men emerged from the woods, their faces concealed by black ski masks. They moved with intent, their strides confident, almost too confident. Jack's stomach dropped. This wasn't a robbery or a random assault. He recognized that walk. They were coming for him. Without hesitation, Jack pushed Noah behind him. "Run, Noah," he said quietly but urgently. "Hide now, but go!" Jack's voice rose, a rare display of panic. Noah froze for just a moment, then dashed into the nearby brush. He crouched low, heart racing, peeking through the thick leaves to see what would unfold. His small hands trembled as he covered his mouth, trying to stifle his breathing. Jack stood tall, squaring his shoulders. He wasn't armed, not here, not with Noah. His badge wouldn't save him now. The 2 masked men halted a few feet away, one of them brandishing a gun aimed directly at Jack's chest. The taller of the 2 spoke, his voice low and steady. "You've been snooping around where you don't belong, Reynolds." Jack's pulse quickened, but he maintained a neutral expression. "I don't know what you're talking about." The second man, shorter and stockier, stepped forward, raising the gun higher. "You know exactly what this is. You've gotten too close to something that isn't yours." Jack glanced toward the bushes where Noah was hiding, his heart sinking. His son shouldn't have to see this, shouldn't witness what was about to happen. But Jack knew there was no escape. He took a slow step forward, placing himself between the gunman and the spot where Noah was concealed. "If this is about money, I'll give it to you," Jack said, his voice calm despite the dread creeping up his spine. "But not here, not with my son watching." The taller man shook his head, almost dismissively. "It's not about the money, Jack. It's about what you know." Before Jack could react, the shorter man pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot shattered the air. Jack staggered back, his hand instinctively moving to his side, where blood was already seeping through his shirt. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. Noah, hidden in the bushes, felt his heart stop. He bit down hard on his lip, tears filling his eyes. "Don't make a sound," he told himself. "Don't let them see you." Jack struggled to prop himself up, his breath shallow and ragged. His vision blurred, but he kept his eyes on the masked men, refusing to show them the fear that was clawing at him. He had to remain strong for Noah. The taller man knelt beside him, removing his mask. Jack's eyes widened in recognition, but his mouth couldn't form the words. "You should have kept your nose out of it, Reynolds," the man whispered, his tone almost regretful. Then he raised his gun and fired 2 more shots, execution style. Jack's body went limp. From his hiding spot, Noah pressed his hand tighter over his mouth, tears streaming down his cheeks. He had to stay hidden, had to stay silent. The masked men didn't linger. They turned, leaving Jack's lifeless body on the ground, disappearing back into the trees as swiftly as they had arrived. Noah waited. His entire body trembled, his mind screaming to rush to his father. But he couldn't move, not yet. Only when the woods fell silent again did Noah finally crawl out from his hiding place. He ran to his father's side, dropping to his knees. "Dad," he whispered, his voice quivering. "Dad, please." But Jack didn't respond. Noah reached for his father's hand, but it was cold, unyielding. The reality crashed over him in waves. His dad was gone. The warmth of their day by the lake, the laughter they shared, all of it torn away in an instant. Alone, Noah sat beside his father's body, the weight of the moment crushing him. He couldn't comprehend it yet, couldn't process what he had just witnessed. But deep down, something had shifted, something irreversible. Noah jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as he stared up at the ceiling, still half trapped in the nightmare. The darkness of his bedroom seemed to close in around him, his father's last moments flashing in his mind. Those masked men, the gunshots, the final breath his father took. "Hey, hey," came a soft voice beside him. His wife, Sarah, turned over, reaching for him. Another nightmare? Noah rubbed a hand over his face, trying to calm himself. He could feel his pulse hammering beneath his skin, the cold dread from the dream still clinging to him like a second skin. "Yeah," he muttered, sitting up and swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. "Same one?" Sarah moved closer, her hand finding the small of his back. "It's been a while since the last one." "Yeah," Noah said again, but his voice was distant, almost detached. He ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the clock on the nightstand. It was 3:17 a.m. Sarah sat up, wrapping her arms around his shoulders from behind. "You want to talk about it?" Noah shook his head. It's always the same. I'm there, I'm hiding, watching. I can't do anything. I couldn't save him." "It wasn't your fault," she said softly, pressing her cheek against his back. "I know," Noah replied, but there was no conviction in his voice. He stared at the floor, his mind racing back to that day. There was something about it, something that had been gnawing at him for years, just beneath the surface. It never sat right. The men that killed his father weren't amateurs. They weren't just a couple of thugs looking for an easy target. They knew what they were doing. They knew who they were coming for. They were too prepared, Noah muttered under his breath. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Noah sighed, standing up from the bed. "Nothing, just something about that day. It feels like it was planned, like they knew him." "You've said that before," Sarah replied, watching him as he paced slowly across the room. "But Noah, you were 10. It's easy for the mind to play tricks on you. You've spent so many years replaying it." "I know what I saw, Sarah," he snapped, then immediately regretted the sharpness in his tone. He stopped pacing, turning to face her. "I'm sorry, it's just, I keep thinking maybe I missed something I should have noticed." Sarah sighed, the fatigue weighing down her voice. "You've been trying to piece it together for years, but maybe there's nothing left to uncover." She patted the space on the bed beside her. "Come back to bed." Noah hesitated. His mind was racing too fast, too many thoughts swirling around. The image of those men, the way they moved, the calmness in their actions. It wasn't random, he was sure of that now, but he couldn't put the pieces together, and the frustration gnawed at him. "I just need some air," Noah said, heading toward the door. Sarah lay back down, pulling the blanket over her. "Okay, just don't stay up all night." Noah gave a brief nod and slipped out of the bedroom, making his way down the hallway to the kitchen. He flipped on the light, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the quiet house. He leaned against the counter, staring at the half-empty coffee pot from the day before. His father's face swam up from his memory, the stern but kind expression, the way he always seemed so sure of himself. Noah had idolized him, always following him around, always wanting to be just like him. He remembered asking his dad if he ever got scared. "Fear's part of the job, kiddo," his dad had said, ruffling his hair. "But you face it, you don't run from it." Noah let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. His father had been a good cop, honest, the kind that made enemies because he didn't back down. And that's what was eating at him. His gut told him that his father had made the wrong enemies, the kind that wouldn't stop until he was dead. He glanced at the clock on the microwave. It was almost 5 a.m. Before he knew it, he needed to get ready for work. Noah trudged back to the bedroom, careful not to wake Sarah as he grabbed his clothes and headed for the bathroom. The steam from the hot shower did little to relax the tension in his shoulders, but it helped him focus. He'd spent his entire life running from the ghosts of that day, but instead of letting them crush him, he channeled that drive into something else, something bigger. Noah pulled on his shirt and stared at his reflection in the mirror. A different man looked back at him now. The boy who'd watched his father die had grown into a man determined to honor his memory, an FBI agent, just like his father had dreamed of being one day. He didn't just protect people, he hunted down those who thought they were above the law, just like the men who took his father's life. He ran a hand through his hair, still dripping wet, and headed out to the kitchen. Sarah was already up, her coffee cup in hand as she stood by the counter. "You're up early," she said with a sleepy smile. Noah kissed her on the cheek and grabbed his keys. "Yeah, work. Be careful," she said, her eyes lingering on him a moment longer. Noah nodded and slipped out the door, his mind already returning to the case he was working on. He wasn't just chasing ghosts anymore, he had work to do. Noah's car pulled into the parking lot of the FBI field office as the sun broke over the horizon, casting a dull orange glow across the building. His mind was still running on fumes from the nightmare, but work had a way of grounding him, giving him something else to focus on. He killed the engine and stared through the windshield for a moment, gathering himself. Inside, the office buzzed with early morning energy, agents on phones, clicking through reports, gathering files. It was a controlled chaos Noah had grown used to. He walked past the bullpen toward the back, heading for the conference room where his team was already assembled. Agent Karen Hall stood at the head of the room, flipping through a case file. She looked up when Noah entered. "About time, Reynolds. Thought you got lost on the way in." Noah smirked and slid into a seat at the table. "Caught in traffic," he said, though everyone knew he was lying. "All right, let's get to it," Hall said, returning to business. "We're focusing all resources on the Carter ring. We've got enough intel to suggest they're moving product through the precinct, and a few uniforms are on the payroll. Our goal is to start cracking down from the middle and work our way up the chain." Noah tensed in his chair. The Carter ring had been a nightmare for law enforcement for months. They had been running drugs, arms, and whatever else they could move right under their noses. But what had grabbed his attention more than anything was that their suspected connections led back to his father's old precinct. Hall passed out updated case files, her face grim. "We've narrowed down a primary suspect, Officer Roy Tate, mid-level, works out of the 22nd. He's been flagged for suspicious behavior, mysterious deposits, unusual traffic in and out of his home, and contacts with known associates of the ring." Noah's pulse quickened. The 22nd precinct, his father's precinct. He clenched his jaw, pushing down the personal angle that threatened to surface. "Tate's been on the force for nearly 20 years, Hall continued, kept a low profile. "But our sources suggest he's the guy handling Carter's operations inside the precinct. We're bringing him in for questioning today." Noah glanced at the photos in the file. Tate looked like any other cop, middle-aged, graying at the temples, a bit of weight in the gut. His expression in the photos was calm, almost smug. He didn't scream drug trafficker, but Noah had learned a long time ago that appearances meant nothing. Hall wrapped up the briefing, tapping the case file for emphasis. "Reynolds, you're taking lead on the interrogation. Let's see what he knows." Noah sat across from Tate in the cold, sterile interrogation room. The two-way mirror reflected back a partial view of his face, but his focus was on the man sitting opposite him, handcuffed to the table. Tate leaned back in his chair, the picture of indifference, his eyes flicking over Noah before he gave a slow grin. "FBI, huh? Must be serious if they're pulling you guys in for questioning." Noah ignored the comment, flipping open the case file in front of him. "Officer Tate, we're investigating your possible involvement with the Carter drug trafficking operation. We know you've been in contact with associates of the ring." Tate's smile faded slightly, but he didn't flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about." Noah tapped the file. "We have surveillance footage of known drug dealers visiting your home. We have your bank records, mysterious cash deposits well above your salary. You want to explain that?" Tate's jaw clenched for a second, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "Maybe I've got a side business. Isn't a crime to make extra money on the side? Noah leaned forward. It is if it's dirty money. Officer Tate's eyes narrowed. He shifted in his seat, clearly growing uncomfortable under the pressure. Look, I'm not involved with Carter. I don't even know half the people you're talking about. Really? Noah raised an eyebrow. You don't know them, but they seem to know you pretty well. Tate remained silent, his expression hardening. Noah let the pause stretch out. Silence had a way of unraveling people, but before Tate could speak, Noah pressed forward again. Officer Tate, I don't think you fully understand what's happening here. We know you're the link between Carter and the precinct. That gives you two choices. Cooperate with us, or go down as the fall guy when this whole operation comes crashing down. Tate's smirk vanished completely, his face cold, calculating. His gaze drifted to the mirror, then back to Noah. You're barking up the wrong tree, Tate said quietly. I'm not your guy. Then who is? Noah shot back. You're not a low-level player in this, Tate. You've been in the game for years. Tate's eyes flicked up to Noah's face, then slowly shifted to the nameplate in front of him. Something changed. His posture stiffened and his gaze locked onto Noah's last name. Reynolds, huh? Tate asked, his voice slower now, deliberate. You related to. He stopped mid-sentence, squinting at Noah like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Are you Jack Reynolds' kid? Noah's entire body tensed. He tried to keep his expression neutral, but the shock was already rippling through him. He hadn't expected this. Not here. Not now. Yeah, Noah said, leaning back in his chair. He was my father. Tate's reaction wasn't what Noah expected. The officer seemed genuinely startled for a moment. His eyes widened, and he blinked a few times, as if trying to absorb the weight of what he had just learned. He let out a low, nervous chuckle and shook his head. Well, I'll be damned, Tate muttered, mostly to himself. Jack Reynolds' kid? Noah's mind was racing now. Why the sudden interest in his father? Why did Tate seem so unnerved by the connection? What does my father have to do with this? Noah asked, keeping his voice steady. Tate didn't respond right away. He stared down at the table, his expression distant, like he was running through a series of calculations in his head. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, he looked up. You really don't know, do you? Tate said, a flicker of something dark passing over his face. Noah's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm, leaning in slightly. No. What? Tate's lips twisted into a bitter smile. Let's just say your father was snooping where he shouldn't have been, and he paid the price for it. Noah's blood ran cold. Noah sat at his desk, staring at the computer screen, but his mind wasn't on the report in front of him. Tate's words from the interrogation room kept replaying in his head. Your father was snooping where he shouldn't have been, and he paid the price for it. Noah had spent years trying to push past the trauma of his father's murder, filing it away as a random act of violence. But the way Tate had reacted, the surprise in his voice, and the sudden interest in Jack Reynolds, it didn't feel random anymore. He closed the report he'd been working on and leaned back in his chair, air tapping his fingers against the desk. His father's old case files. He hadn't looked at them in years. After the funeral, there had been too much pain, too much grief. But now, with fresh eyes, there was a chance, just maybe, that they held answers. His father had been a good cop, too good to let something slip through the cracks. If he'd been investigating corruption, there had to be a trail. Noah took a breath, stood up, and headed down to the archives. The old precinct building was quieter than he remembered. His keycard still worked. He hadn't been here in years, but there was a certain heaviness as he stepped into the musty basement, where decades of case files were stored. Rows of metal shelves stretched out before him, filled with boxes of reports, evidence logs, and case summaries. Noah found the section marked 1990 to 1995. His father had been killed in 1994. It didn't take long to find Jack Reynolds' name on the side of a box. He pulled it out, carrying it to a nearby table. The case files inside were mostly routine, traffic stops, drug busts, small-time criminals. Noah flipped through them, frowning. Nothing jumped out. But then, at the bottom of the box, tucked beneath a stack of old reports, he found something different. A small notebook, its pages worn and yellowed with age. His father's handwriting covered the front, for eyes only. Noah's pulse quickened as he opened it. The first few pages were cryptic, filled with shorthand notes and initials that didn't mean much without context. But as he flipped through, pieces started to fall into place. There were names, officers Noah recognized from the precinct, including some that were still around today. Next to the names were question marks, arrows, and phrases like suspected ties to organized crime and cash deposits unaccounted for. His father had been onto something big. Noah's eyes scanned down the pages. As the notes continued, they grew more specific. His father had been tracking movements, drug shipments, meetings that didn't add up, officers clocking in and out of shifts they weren't scheduled for. It was all connected. And then a date jumped out at him. July 1994, the summer his father was killed. The last few pages of the notebook were rushed, the handwriting sloppier, moving faster than expected. "Someone's onto me. I think I'm being followed. We'll meet with Roy to confirm details." Noah's heart stopped. Roy. Officer Roy Tate. His father had been working with Tate, or at least he thought Tate might know something. Noah flipped back through the earlier pages, finding another note. Carter might be the key. Higher than we thought. Someone else pulling the strings. The writing was smudged, almost unreadable. But Noah could make out the gist. The Carter ring wasn't some small-time operation. His father had been close to unearthing a conspiracy. Noah sat back, the weight of the realization crashing over him. His father's death hadn't been random. Jack Reynolds had been digging too deep, getting too close to the truth. And for that, he was killed. Noah closed the notebook, his fingers trembling. Everything was connected. The drug ring, the corrupt cops, and now Tate. His father had died because of the same operation Noah was investigating. Tate's reaction earlier made sense now. He had known all along, but he wasn't the only one. Noah stood in the observation room, watching through the two-way mirror as Roy Tate sat in the interrogation room, fidgeting. The officer had been arrested earlier that morning. His house swarmed with agents after Noah had pulled enough evidence to bring him in. Tate had tried to play it cool during the arrest, but Noah could see the cracks. Now, in the stark, empty room, Tate looked less confident, more anxious. Noah straightened his tie and walked into the room, closing the door behind him. He dropped a thick case file on the table with a loud thud and took a seat across from Tate. The room was silent for a moment. The only sound, the faint ticking of the wall clock. "Officer Tate," Noah began, his voice steady but firm. "You know why you're here?" Tate crossed his arms, leaning back in the chair with force. Nonchalant. "I'm not saying anything without my lawyer." Noah smirked. "Sure, you can have your lawyer, but that's not going to change the fact that we've got more than enough to bury you. You're in deep, Tate. Drug money, backdoor deals, aiding and abetting one of the biggest trafficking rings in the state." Tate's eyes flickered for just a second, nervousness creeping in, but he didn't say anything. Noah leaned forward, tapping the case file. "Your bank records, surveillance footage, phone logs, all of it ties you directly to the Carter ring. We've got witnesses who've seen you talking to their guys, and the deposits in your account don't exactly scream honest cop. So here's your chance to come clean. Make it easier for yourself." Tate clenched his jaw. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're fishing." "You think this is fishing?" Noah shot back, opening the file and spreading out the documents in front of Tate. "We've got enough to pin you for at least 10 years. But you know that's not the worst part. You've been around long enough to know what happens to guys like you in lockup, especially ones that turn their back on the force." Tate's facade cracked just a bit, his fingers twitching against the table. Noah pressed forward. "But here's the deal. You give me something useful, names, details, someone higher up, I'll talk to the DA, see what we can do to lighten the sentence. Help you out." Tate swallowed hard, staring down at the papers. He was teetering, and Noah could sense it. But he wasn't there for just the drug operation. He needed more. His father's face flashed through his mind. "Stay focused," he told himself. "Why don't we start simple?" Noah leaned back, his tone shifting. "Tell me about the night Jack Reynolds was murdered." Tate's head snapped up, his eyes wide. It was the first time Noah had seen real fear in them. "You remember him, don't you?" Noah asked, voice cold. "My father?" Tate didn't answer. He shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the mirror. Noah's voice dropped, steady and deliberate. "You were there, weren't you, that night by the lake? The two masked men?" Tate's silence was answer enough. Noah stood, leaning over the table, anger starting to simmer in his voice. "You murdered him!" "I didn't pull the trigger," Tate snapped, his voice suddenly desperate, his eyes wide with panic. "I didn't shoot him!" Noah froze, his heart pounding. The admission hung in the air, heavy and raw. Tate breathed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "I was there, yeah, but I didn't kill him. I was just following orders." Noah sat back down slowly, trying to keep control even as rage boiled inside him. "Who ordered?" Tate hesitated, his eyes darting around the room like a man trapped with no escape. "Look, I was a nobody back then. A low-level cop. I didn't have a choice." He was snooping around, asking questions about things that were way above his pay grade, things he shouldn't have been digging into. "What things?" Noah pressed. Tate swallowed. "Your old man, he was close. Too close to exposing something big. The Carter ring, sure, but that wasn't the half of it. The whole precinct was involved. Cops, lieutenants, all of them on the take. He didn't know when to back off." Noah's fist tightened under the table. "Who else was there that night, Tate? Who was the other man?" Tate's face paled. He shifted in his seat, looking down at his cuffed hands, avoiding Noah's eyes. "If I tell you, they'll kill me," Tate muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll protect you," Noah said firmly. "You give me a name, I'll make sure you get witness protection. You won't serve a single day in prison if you help us take him down." Tate stared at the table for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he looked up, his eyes hollow, voice shaking. "You don't get it. This guy, he's untouchable, been in the game longer than any of us. He's got friends in high places. If I give him up, I'm dead." "Who is he?" Noah demanded, his voice hardening. "Give me his name." Tate hesitated, then exhaled deeply, defeated. His voice was barely audible as he spoke the words. "Frank Bennett." Noah's heart stopped. "Chief Frank Bennett," he repeated, his voice low and disbelieving. Tate nodded slowly. "Yeah, he was the other man that night. He pulled the trigger. He's been running the show ever since." Noah leaned back, his mind spinning. Chief Bennett, his father's old colleague, the man who'd climbed the ranks and was now running the entire precinct, was the one who'd killed his father. The man he trusted, respected, was the same one who had orchestrated the murder. Tate slumped in his chair, his face etched with fear. "Now you know, but if you go after him, you better be ready for a war." Noah stood, staring down at Tate, his voice cold. "Thanks for the tip. I'll handle it from here." Noah leaned against the cold wall of the holding cell hallway, his mind buzzing with 1,000 thoughts. He had just come out of another meeting with the district attorney, arranging for Roy Tate's placement in witness protection. Tate had spilled too much. He'd practically signed his own death warrant the moment he mentioned Chief Bennett's name. Tate, however, wasn't reassured. In the interrogation room, he'd been shaking, unable to sit still. Noah had seen fear before, but this was something else, pure panic. "They're going to kill me," Tate had muttered, pacing the small room, his cuffed hands trembling. "You don't understand. Bennett's got reach everywhere. I won't make it through the night." "I've got you covered," Noah said, his voice calm but firm. "We're moving you out of here. You'll be safe. Witness protection is airtight." Tate had stopped pacing, turning to Noah with wide eyes. "There's no safe from Bennett. He runs everything. He'll find me no matter where you put me." Noah had seen the desperation in Tate's eyes, but he had tried to reassure him. "Stay calm. Follow protocol. You'll be out of here soon. Just hold tight." Tate was their key witness. With his testimony, they could bring Bennett down. The plan was already in motion. The next morning, Noah arrived at the office hoping to move forward with the case, but the moment he stepped inside, he was met with grim faces. Karen Hall approached him, her face pale, lips pressed into a thin line. "Noah, there's something you need to hear," she said quietly. "What is it?" "Tate's dead," she said, her voice almost too soft to hear. Noah froze. "What?" "He was found dead in his cell early this morning. They're calling it a suicide." Noah's blood ran cold. His mind raced as he processed her words. Suicide? There was no way! Tate had been terrified, yes, but he had been desperate to live, not to end his own life. Hall glanced around the room, lowering her voice. "Look, it's all being reported as a clean suicide. The higher-ups are sticking to it, but you and I both know what this is." Noah clenched his fists. Tate had been silenced. Bennett had reached him. Even in custody, Noah could feel it. He'd seen this game played before. The chief was cleaning house, and Tate had been the first casualty. Noah's gut twisted. He was next in line. "You need to be careful," Hall warned, her voice low. "If Bennett's this deep, he'll come for you next." Noah nodded, the weight of the situation settling in. He was in the crosshairs now, but he wasn't going to back down. The chief had to pay, and Noah wasn't about to let fear stop him. Noah's phone buzzed on his desk, snapping him out of his thoughts. A text message. He unlocked the screen and stared at the message. "Back off, Reynolds, or you're next. No sender, no number, just a warning." Noah tightened his grip on the phone. His jaw clenched. He'd been expecting this, knew it would come eventually, but it didn't make the reality any less chilling. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He glanced up, catching Karen Hall's eye across the room. She had been watching him closely ever since Tate's suicide. She gave him a nod, as if to say, "We're in this together." But even with her support, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that this was now his fight and his alone. Later that night, Noah drove home through the quiet city streets. The adrenaline from the day still pumped through his veins, keeping him on edge. Every shadow, every flash of headlights made his skin prickle. He checked his rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes. Nothing. But he couldn't shake the feeling someone was watching him, waiting. His phone buzzed again, another text. "Last chance, Reynolds. Stop digging or you won't make it home." Noah's heart pounded. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, eyes scanning the road ahead. This was it. He was next on Bennett's list, just like Tate had warned. Suddenly, a dark van shot out from a side street, ramming into the rear of Noah's car. His head snapped back from the impact, his heart leaping into his throat. His car swerved violently, tires screeching as he fought to regain control. Before he could react, 2 masked men on motorcycles appeared on either side of his car, guns drawn, just like the night his father was killed. Noah slammed on the gas, his car roaring as it surged forward, but the men didn't back off. They opened fire, bullets smashing into the driver's side window, glass shattering around him. Noah ducked, swerving wildly through the street. Adrenaline surged through him as he yanked the wheel hard to the left, slamming one of the motorcyclists against a parked car. The rider spun out, crashing into the pavement with a sickening thud, but the other one stayed on his tail, gunfire still raining down on Noah's car. His mind raced, heart pounding. Noah reached under the seat and grabbed his Glock, eyes locked on the road ahead. The second motorcyclist pulled up beside him, aiming his gun directly at Noah's head. Without thinking, Noah jerked the wheel to the right, crashing into the bike as the rider swerved to keep balance. Noah fired 2 shots out the shattered window. The rider jerked backward, losing control, and tumbled off the bike onto the road. Breathing hard, Noah floored the gas, putting as much distance between him and the attackers as possible. The van that had first hit him was still in pursuit, its headlights bearing down on him. Another gunshot rang out, this time shattering the rear window. Noah's pulse raced as he made a sharp turn down an alley, the narrow space barely wide enough for his car. The van screeched to a halt at the entrance, but its size prevented it from following. Noah's hands shook as he sped through the alley, his car rattling from the damage. The moment he had an open road again, relief washed over him. But it was short-lived. His arm felt warm, too warm. He glanced down and saw blood soaking his sleeve. One of the bullets had grazed him. A sudden dizziness hit him, and his vision blurred as the adrenaline began to wear off. He fought to keep his focus, his foot heavy on the gas. He couldn't stop, not yet. The next thing Noah remembered was waking up to the harsh, sterile lights of the hospital room. His head throbbed and his arm was bandaged, the sting of the wound dulled by painkillers. Karen Hall stood at the foot of his bed, arms crossed, her face a mix of anger and concern. "Hell of a night, huh?" she said, her voice low. Noah groaned, pushing himself upright. "How bad? You got lucky." "A bullet grazed your arm, but it could have been worse. You passed out from blood loss. We almost lost you." Noah leaned back against the pillow, wincing as the memories of the attack flooded back. "It was them, Hall. Bennett's guys. Same tactics they used on my father. They're not just warning me anymore. They're coming to finish the job." Hall's expression hardened. "We've got to move fast. Bennett's not going to stop until you're dead." Noah lay in his hospital bed, staring at the sterile ceiling. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitored his only company. His arm throbbed under the bandages, the painkillers doing little to numb the ache. The attack had left him physically drained, but his mind raced. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. A tall man in a white coat stepped in, carrying a clipboard. He had a calm demeanor, glasses perched low on his nose. "Agent Reynolds?" the man asked, his voice smooth, professional. "I'm Dr. Marshall, just here to check on you." Noah's instincts flared up instantly. He hadn't heard of any Dr. Marshall. His regular doctor had just left, and there hadn't been any mention of a follow-up visit this soon. Something was off. "Yeah," Noah muttered, keeping his tone casual. "Everything okay?" Dr. Marshall smiled, stepping closer to the bed, his eyes scanning the clipboard. "Just need to check your vitals. Routine, nothing to worry about." But Noah was already on edge. He watched the man's hands carefully, noticing the slight twitch in his right hand, the way his fingers brushed against the inside of his coat pocket. The man's movements were too deliberate, too rehearsed. "All right," Noah said slowly, shifting in the bed, trying not to give away his suspicion. "Go ahead." The doctor reached into his coat pocket, and Noah's eyes followed the movement. Instead of a stethoscope, the man's fingers closed around something metal. Noah's pulse quickened. "A syringe!" Before the man could make his move, Noah acted on pure instinct. He swung his injured arm up, knocking the syringe from the man's hand. It clattered to the floor. But the fake doctor didn't hesitate. His other hand shot out, grabbing Noah by the throat, forcing him back against the bed. Noah gasped, his vision blurring for a moment as the grip tightened around his windpipe. But he wasn't about to go down without a fight. He reached out, grabbing the IV stand next to the bed, yanking it free and swinging it with as much force as he could muster. The metal pole connected with the man's shoulder, causing him to stumble back. Noah coughed, gasping for air as he scrambled off the bed. His head spun from the sudden movement, the pain in his arm flaring up, but he pushed through it. The assassin lunged at him again, this time pulling a knife from his coat. Noah barely had time to react, dodging the blade as it sliced through the air inches from his face. He grabbed the nearest object, a bedside table, and shoved it into the man's path, trying to buy himself a second to think. The two men clashed again, fists and limbs flying. The assassin was fast, but Noah was driven by adrenaline. He blocked the next knife strike with his forearm, gritting his teeth against the pain, and slammed his fist into the man's jaw. The impact sent the assassin stumbling backward, blood trickling from his lip. Noah wasted no time. He grabbed the assassin by the collar, yanking him toward the floor. The knife clattered out of his hand as Noah pinned him down, pressing his knee into the man's chest. "Who sent you?" Noah growled, his voice hoarse from the strain. "Bennett." The man only sneered, his eyes full of malice. He twisted under Noah's grip, trying to break free, but Noah was too strong, too determined. "It doesn't matter," the assassin spat. "You're already dead." Noah slammed the man's head against the tile floor, knocking him out cold. Breathing heavily, he stood up, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. He staggered back to the bed, hitting the call button with his fist. Minutes later, hospital security and staff rushed into the room. The unconscious assassin was handcuffed and dragged away by law enforcement. Noah sat on the edge of the bed, his pulse still racing, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Karen Hall arrived not long after, her face pale when she saw the damage to the room. "Jesus, Noah," she muttered. "They sent someone after you here?" "Bennett's getting desperate," Noah said, his voice low. "He knows I'm close. He's trying to tie up loose ends." Hall stood in silence for a moment, then nodded. "We've got to move fast." The man wouldn't stop until Noah was dead. "We're out of time." "Hall," Noah said, standing up, ignoring the throbbing in his arm. "This isn't just a case anymore. Bennett's not going to stop until he takes me out. I need to end this now." Hall's eyes met his, a mix of fear and resolve. She knew what was coming. They both did. "All right," she said quietly. "What's the plan?" "Plan?" Noah grabbed his jacket, his face set with determination. "We go straight to the top." Noah stood in front of the imposing house, its neat lawn and perfect porch light casting a warm glow over the street. It didn't fit, none of it did. Not the quiet suburban neighborhood, not the well-kept facade. This was the home of Frank Bennett, police chief, the same man Noah was sure had ordered the hit on him, just like he had on his father. His heart pounded as he raised his fist to knock. The truth was there, just behind this door. He wasn't leaving until he had answers. The door swung open, and Bennett stood there, wearing a button-up shirt and slacks, his face a picture of ease, like he just finished a peaceful evening at home. His smile was wide but didn't reach his eyes. "Noah," Bennett said, surprised but casual. "This is a late visit. What brings you here?" Noah forced a tight smile. "I need to talk. It's important." Bennett held the door open. "Come in. It sounds serious." Noah stepped inside, every sense on high alert. He glanced around at the photos on the wall. Pictures of Bennett and his wife on vacations, smiling for the camera. He wondered how many of the people in those photos knew who Bennett really was. "Sit," Bennett offered, gesturing to the leather couch. "What's on your mind, son?" Noah stayed standing. "It's about the drug case," he started, his voice steady, probing. "We've been digging deeper, finding connections where we didn't expect them." Bennett nodded, though there was a flicker in his eyes. "That's good news, right? We need to root out all the rot in the precinct. Always have." Noah narrowed his eyes. "That's what I thought too, until we started finding the rot at the top." Bennett's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened just a little. He gave Noah a smile that was just a bit too forced. "You're talking about me, aren't you?" Noah didn't back down. "Your name's been coming up, Frank. Your old ties to some of the people we've been investigating. It's making people wonder." Bennett chuckled, low and controlled, leaning back slightly in his chair. "Wonder about what?" "Noah, I've been cleaning up this city for over 20 years. I've put more scumbags behind bars than you've had birthdays." "That might be true," Noah replied, stepping closer, keeping his voice calm. "But not all the scumbags ended up behind bars, did they?" The smile vanished. Bennett's eyes flicked to the side for a second, just long enough for Noah to catch. He knew he'd struck a nerve. Noah pressed on. "You see, I've been looking into my father's old files, his investigations, and it's interesting what I found. He wasn't just working on the usual corruption cases. He was digging into something deeper." Bennett's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Your father was a good cop, one of the best. Whatever he was working on back then, it was a long time ago." "Noah, I don't see how it connects to anything now." Noah's voice dropped, the tension between them rising. "I think it connects perfectly. He was close to something big. Yafto, that's why he was killed." For the first time, Bennett's mask slipped, a twitch of the mouth, a shift in his stance. Noah saw it. Bennett tried to cover it with a dismissive wave. "You're chasing ghosts!" "Noah, I told you, your father's death was a tragedy, but it was just a robbery gone wrong." Noah shook his head slowly. "No, it wasn't. It was an execution." Bennett's eyes locked onto Noah's, harder now, defensive. "I don't know what you think you're onto, but you're wrong." Noah stepped closer, his voice cold. "Am I? Then why did Tate die? Why was he killed after he named you?" The room fell into silence. Bennett didn't blink, didn't move. Noah watched him closely, the silence heavy, crackling between them. It stretched, hanging in the air like a taut wire. Then Noah said it, the name that hung between them like a weight. "Did you know my father?" Frank Bennett's face hardened. He glanced at Noah, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time, he didn't bother with the mask. He didn't even try to hide it. "Your father," Bennett said slowly, almost deliberately, "was a man who couldn't leave well enough alone." Noah's breath caught. He'd expected something, but the coldness in Bennett's tone sent a chill through him. He stepped forward, heart racing. "What do you mean?" The chief's expression remained cold. "He was getting too close. So yes, I had him taken care of." Noah's hands shook with rage, his blood boiling. "You murdered him!" Bennett's eyes flashed. "I did what I had to do. Your father was about to blow everything wide open. If it wasn't me, it would have been someone else." The confession was out there now, raw and chilling. Bennett stood firm, his posture one of twisted pride. He seemed almost relieved to finally say it aloud. But no, it wasn't done. He stepped closer, his voice tight with fury. "And now you're trying to do the same to me?" Bennett smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. "You should have backed off, kid. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Noah couldn't hold back any longer. With a surge of rage, he lunged at Bennett, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him into the wall. Bennett gasped, but reacted quickly, shoving Noah back with surprising force. The room erupted in chaos. Bennett swung a fist, catching Noah in the ribs, knocking the wind out of him. but Noah recovered, throwing a punch that connected with Bennett's jaw, sending him stumbling back. "You're done, Bennett!" Noah shouted, charging at him again. Bennett growled, his face contorted with rage. He threw another wild punch, but Noah ducked, grabbing Bennett by the arm and twisting it behind his back. Bennett snarled in pain, trying to shake free, but Noah held him firm. "You think you can take me down?" Bennett spat, slamming his elbow into Noah's injured side. Noah grunted, pain shooting through his body, but he didn't let go. He shoved Bennett forward, sending him crashing into a nearby table, knocking over a vase. The chief scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, his eyes wild with fury. He reached for a knife from the counter, lunging at Noah with desperate energy. But Noah was quicker. He sidestepped the attack and kicked Bennett's legs out from under him. The knife clattered to the floor. Before Bennett could get up, Noah was on him, pinning him down, holding him in place with all the strength he had left. "It's over," Noah said, his voice cold and steady. Bennett struggled beneath him, his breathing ragged. "You don't know what you've started, kid," he hissed. "You're out of your league." Noah didn't respond. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his handcuffs. "Chief Frank Bennett," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "you're under arrest for drug trafficking, corruption, and the murder of Jack Reynolds." Bennett's face twisted with fury as Noah cuffed his hands behind his back. "You'll regret this, Reynolds. You have no idea what's coming." Noah stood, pulling Bennett to his feet, ignoring the chief's threats. He led him toward the door, his grip firm. "I'll see you in court," Noah said, his voice ice cold. As Noah dragged Bennett out into the night, the weight of the moment settled over him. He had done it. His father's killer was finally in cuffs. The courtroom was packed. The buzz of whispers, the shuffle of papers, the hum of tension filled the air. Noah sat at the front, his hands gripping the armrest of his chair, trying to steady himself as the trial of Chief Frank Bennett officially began. It had taken weeks to get here, and every moment felt like a lifetime. Now everything would be laid bare. The chief sat across the room, dressed in a suit that didn't match the man he really was. Bennett's face was calm, almost defiant, his eyes scanning the room as if the outcome didn't concern him. His defense team, sharp and polished, was ready to mount their argument to paint Bennett as anything but the mastermind behind the corruption. But Noah was ready too. He'd spent years preparing for this, even if he hadn't known it. The trial began, and Bennett's attorney wasted no time setting the tone. A tall, smooth-talking man named Marcus Hartley stood and addressed the jury with confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "my client, Frank Bennett, has been caught in a web of corruption, yes, but not by choice. He was pressured by forces far beyond his control, forces much more powerful than any one man. Frank Bennett is not the criminal here. He is a victim of circumstance, a man who simply got in too deep with the wrong people." Noah's stomach turned as Hartley continued, spinning a narrative that made Bennett look like a puppet rather than the one pulling the strings. The attorney argued that Bennett had no choice but to comply with the demands of dangerous individuals, people high up in the food chain of the drug trade. Chief Bennett was simply trying to survive, Hartley claimed, to protect his own life and the lives of those close to him. Noah clenched his fists. The lies were piling up, and the worst part was that the jury seemed to be listening. Hartley was good, too good. His words oozed with a calculated sympathy for Bennett, like he was just an innocent man who'd made the wrong enemies. Noah fought to stay calm. He'd get his chance to tell the truth soon enough. When it was the prosecution's turn, they laid out their case meticulously. The lead prosecutor, Rachel Monroe, was relentless. She detailed the entire network of corruption within the police force, linking it directly to Bennett's command. She introduced the evidence that Noah and his team had painstakingly gathered financial records, surveillance, and the final nail in the coffin, Bennett's confession to Noah about murdering his father. And then it was Noah's turn. He took the stand, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. He sat tall, trying to focus on the facts, but the emotions threatened to pull him under. The prosecutor approached him. "Noah Reynolds," Monroe began, "can you tell us about the night your father was murdered?" Noah's throat tightened. He took a breath, steeling himself. "I was 10, he said, his voice steady but low. "My father and I were at the lake. 2 men masked ambushed him. He told me to run. I hid and watched as they killed him." The courtroom was silent. Everyone's eyes were on Noah, but he kept his focus on the prosecutor. He couldn't let the emotion take over. Monroe nodded, encouraging him to continue. Did you know at the time who these men were? Noah shook his head. No, I didn't find out until recently. One of them was Frank Bennett. There was a murmur in the crowd, but Monroe raised her hand to silence it. And how did you come to learn that Chief Bennett was involved in your father's murder? I've been investigating a drug trafficking ring that's tied to the police force, Noah explained. It led me back to Bennett. When I confronted him, he admitted it. He said my father was getting too close to exposing everything. The defense immediately jumped in, objecting. Your Honor, that's hearsay. The judge overruled the objection. Monroe continued. You're saying that Chief Bennett confessed to your father's murder? Noah nodded, looking directly at the jury. Yes, he said. My father was going to blow the whole operation open, and that's why he killed him. Monroe turned to the jury, letting the weight of Noah's words settle. Thank you, Agent Reynolds. No further questions. When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine Noah, Hartley wasted no time trying to dismantle his credibility. Agent Reynolds, Hartley began, pacing the floor. You've experienced significant trauma, haven't you? Noah narrowed his eyes. I've lost my father. I wouldn't call that trauma. I'd call it murder. Hartley smirked. Of course, but trauma affects the mind, doesn't it? Makes memories unreliable. Maybe you've built up this narrative in your head, wanting to believe Chief Bennett is responsible. Noah's jaw clenched. The facts don't lie. Hartley didn't back down. But people do. You said Chief Bennett confessed to you, but you have no recording of this confession, do you? No, but no further questions, Hartley interrupted, spinning back to his seat. We all see what's going on here, Noah seethed, but held his tongue. The truth was on his side, and that was what mattered. The trial dragged on for days, with witness after witness taking the stand. But despite Hartley's best efforts, the truth couldn't be buried. The evidence was too damning, the connections too clear. Frank Bennett had orchestrated a drug ring, killed Noah's father, and covered it up for years. When the final arguments were made, the jury was left to deliberate. Hours passed, each minute agonizing for Noah as he waited for justice. For his father, for himself. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. We, the jury, find the defendant, Frank Bennett, guilty of all charges. The words hung in the air. A weight lifted from Noah's chest. He closed his eyes for a moment, relief washing over him, though he knew the battle wasn't over. The judge turned to Bennett, her voice calm but firm, ready to deliver the sentence. Chief Frank Bennett, the judge began, you have been found guilty of the charges of drug trafficking, corruption, and first-degree murder. The crimes you committed are an unforgivable betrayal of the badge you swore to honor. You abused your position of power to traffic drugs, and when an innocent man got too close to the truth, you took his life to protect your criminal operation. Noah watched Bennett's face. The man who once wielded control over an entire police force now looked defeated, his arrogance shattered. Your actions have caused irreparable harm, not only to the victims and their families, but to the community you were entrusted to protect, the judge continued. The court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There was a gasp in the courtroom, followed by a ripple of hushed conversation. Bennett's expression hardened, a final flicker of defiance in his eyes as he was handcuffed by the bailiff. But the chief didn't resist. He knew this was the end of the line. The judge added one final note. You will spend the remainder of your life in a federal penitentiary. May this sentence serve as a message to others that no one, no matter their rank or title, is above the law. Bennett was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his face pale, his eyes fixed ahead. As he passed Noah, he muttered under his breath, "This isn't over." Noah didn't respond. He knew Bennett was right. The trial had exposed several corrupt officers, but there were higher powers at work. The drug trafficking network Bennett was part of was larger than anyone had anticipated. There were more people involved, people with even more power. As Noah left the courthouse, the sun setting in the distance, he made a silent vow. He would keep fighting, keep pushing, until every last person involved was brought to justice. He owed that to his father and to himself. It was quiet at the cemetery. A light breeze rustled through the trees, and the fading afternoon sun cast long shadows over the rows of gravestones. Noah stood there for a moment, just watching the wind tug at the leaves. He wasn't sure how long he had been standing in front of his father's grave, but it didn't matter. Time felt different here. It always had. Taking a deep breath, he knelt down, his hand brushing over the cold stone. The name Jack Reynolds was etched into the granite, along with the words, "Beloved Father." Beneath it, his father's face flickered through his mind, strong, steady, full of life. The man he had admired more than anyone. The man he had watched die. "It's over, Dad," Noah said quietly. "I got him." The words hung in the air for a moment, the gravity of them finally sinking in. Weeks had passed since the trial, since Bennett had been sentenced to life in prison. The chief's face still haunted Noah's thoughts from time to time, the smugness he had carried right up until the jury had delivered their verdict. But the fight was over for now. Bennett had been brought to justice. And though the larger network of corruption was still out there, Noah had done what he'd set out to do. He'd avenged his father's death. Noah sat back on his heels, running a hand through his hair. The weight of everything he had been through, the nightmares, the investigation, the betrayals, came crashing down in that moment. He had spent years chasing answers, working tirelessly to uncover the truth. And now that he finally had it, it was hard to process. Hard to accept that the man who had shattered his life was rotting in a cell somewhere while the world outside kept moving. His mind drifted back to the early days. The night of his father's murder was always the sharpest memory. His father telling him to run, the crack of gunfire, the sight of his dad collapsing. Then the endless questions that followed, the sleepless nights, and the feeling of helplessness that had fueled him for so long. He had lived every day with that pain, that gnawing anger, and while the anger hadn't disappeared, it had dulled, softened into something else now, something like peace. "I didn't know how this was going to end," Noah whispered to the gravestone, "but I kept my promise. I wasn't going to let him get away with it." His voice wavered slightly, but he didn't let the emotion swallow him. There was still work to do. The drug ring Bennett was part of was larger than anyone had imagined, and though Bennett was behind bars, there were others still out there, higher powers who had yet to face justice. Noah knew the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for now, he had this. He had closure. Noah stood slowly, brushing off the dirt from his pants. His wife, Sarah, stood a few feet away, quietly giving him space. She'd been by his side through it all. The sleepless nights, the close calls, the hospital bed where he had nearly died. She was the one thing that had kept him grounded, kept him fighting, even when he wanted to give up. He walked over to her, and she reached out, taking his hand. Without saying a word, they didn't need to speak. She understood what this moment meant to him. Together they stood in silence for a while, the wind gently brushing past them, the world stilling around them. "I'm proud of you," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. Noah squeezed her hand, looking out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. The sky was streaked with orange and purple, the light fading away, but not in a way that felt sad. It felt like the end of one chapter and the start of another. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice quieter now. He felt lighter. For the first time in a long time, "Let's go home." They turned and began to walk away side by side, their shadows stretching long behind them as they walked toward the car. Noah felt the weight of the past loosen its grip just a little. The road ahead would still be long, still full of battles to fight. But today, for this moment, he had peace. If you enjoyed this story, give the video a like and subscribe for more. In the meantime, why not give these videos a watch?